This meeting is being recorded.
We are dedicating today's learning, as mentioned, to the memory and the solace of Peter, Jason, and Diane's and the family, children, etc. May his soul be firmly ensconced in God's loving embrace.
Thank you.
So, this week's parsha is an interesting one. It is another one of those situations where it's puzzling to understand why when Moshe doesn't get a parsha named after him. And you can say, okay, maybe Moshe doesn't get a parsha named after because the whole Torah is named after him. Torah Moshe. But Avram Avinu doesn't get a Torah portion. Sarah Imenu doesn't get a Torah portion. Aaron, Moshe's brother, doesn't get a Torah portion. Miriam doesn't get a Torah portion. And yet Balak, right, this wicked king, he gets a Torah portion. This is two in a row now, right? We had not two in a row, but the week before last was Korach, and now we have Balak, and it seems to be some pretty ne'er-do-wells get Torah portions. Right, get Torah portions named after them, right? But interestingly enough, Balak is perhaps not the biggest villain of this Torah portion, right? There's a bigger villain in this Torah portion, and that is the fellow that Balak hires, right? Balak is almost, the Torah portion is named after him, and yet to a certain degree, he's second fiddle in terms of being the troublemaker. The troublemaker in this week's Torah portion is Bilam. Now, this is, by the way, interesting. This Torah portion is interesting in a different way. It's an interesting Torah portion in the fact that that the camera angle, if you want just to kind of borrow a term here, is focused in a strange direction. Usually, or not usually, always, from the moment that we are introducing the Jewish people, the beginning of Shemot, right? Up until this point, it was individuals, right? Or at least an individual family. It was the Abramowitz family, right? But now, starting from the book of Shemot, we pan out and we take in the entire nation. The camera is firmly affixed on the Jewish people. Right, the camera angle is firmly affixed on the Jewish people, and whatever is occurs within the context of the Jewish people of when whatever that is interacts with the Jewish people. Not this parsha. This parsha, the Jewish people are really relegated to the background. Again, it is a unique parsha in that regard. The parsha opens up, we have switched seats, right? We are now not in the Jewish camp. We are in the throne room of Balak as he sits there and figures out what's he gonna do. He's got a problem, got a real problem. He's got a Jewish problem, right? Unfortunately, that's a and the anti-Semitic favorite problem, right? And you've got a Jewish problem because the people that have busted their way out of Egypt have made their way through the desert, now faced off with the two sentinels that were the protection of the land beyond, which were Sichon and Og, were the two unconquerable, not only individuals, but land. As we said, the Talmud said, very interesting, that even if the land, the city of Heshbon, which was the capital city of Sichon, was filled with fleas, it would have been unconquerable. It was such a powerful city. And had Sichon, their king, had to try and defend a truly an indefensible particular piece of land, he would still have been unconquerable. In other words, the land was unconquerable, and the king, the general was unconquerable. Put the two of them together, and it was just like compounding unconquerability. And yet the Jewish people, and we haven't even gotten to Og, right? The world's last giant, right? Surviving all the way from the time of the flood. And yet here, and so these two, everybody on the other side, even though it says that at the moment of the splitting of the sea, that the Canaanites, right, Namogu, Kulioshvi, Canaan, all the Canaanites were trembling because everybody knew the Jews' final
They melted.
Destination. They knew, everybody was well aware of the lore that God promised Abraham that this would be his land. And they knew when the Jewish people busted out of Egypt where they headed. Everybody knew. It wasn't a secret. Yet, if there was one thing, the ace in their hole, as it were, the one thing they were able to rely on was the fact that, we'll be okay. We're on the other side of Sichon and Og. That's like the breakwater, right? That's the dam. We're fine. We're going to be fine. And then the Jewish people come to Sichon and Og, and they turn them into cholent, right? Boom. Lickety split. Sichon and Og are no longer a problem. They're gone. In fact, it gets worse. Some of these big, impregnable cities, not worse for the Jews, but Moshe sends a group of spies to scout out. Yeah, don't worry. You heard the word spies, and Moshe sends them, and you're like, hey, vague. No. This is the next generation. These guys are on the ball, right? Moshe sends a group of spies to just scout out a particular piece of land, and while George Patton was an anti-Semite, by the way, so we generally don't quote him for in a laudatory way. At least I wouldn't. But it happens to be that obviously there's a famous moment in Patton, the American general in World War II, where he was steamrolling his way through certain parts of Europe, and high command basically says, "Hey, listen, we think you're overextending yourself. So when you get to this particular region, slow down and stop and wait for reinforcements. Don't go on and try to." So he sends back a dispatch. He says, "I already conquered it. Should I give it back?" Exactly. It's like, what do you want me to do? So they sent the spies to scout it out, and then the spies were like, "Okay, we'll take it," and they took it. They conquered. They were meant just to be the scouting party, and they conquered it. The Jewish people were just steamrolling their way, and now Balak is dealing with the fact that they are literally on his doorsteps, as he says, right? This nation that just steamed its way over. V'hu yoshev mimuli. Right, this is the message he's sending off to Balaam, right? He's saying, and now they are literally opposite me. Right, I'm staring at them. They were supposed to be stuck behind Sichon and Og, and now they're right in front of me. I don't know what to do because I was actually coronated as king to deal with this problem. And now it's my problem, and I'm supposed to be the one that will find the solution to this. And so, to his credit, Balak actually does get creative in his efforts. Now, here's the thing. Again, Balak is a textbook example of an anti-Semite. Why? Because Jewish people presented him as much of a threat as they did the Egyptians back in the beginning. And by as much of a threat, I mean no threat whatsoever. The Jewish people weren't a threat to the Egyptians, and they weren't a threat to Melech Moab, to the king, to Balak. Why? Because when the Jewish people were living in Egypt, when Pharaoh decided that they were a threat, they wanted nothing to. Wanted to do nothing more than just exist benignly. vis-a-vis this particular people. Jewish people had no interest in any type of violence or antagonism to the Egyptians. In fact, as we said, the way the Egyptians were able to enslave this population was to play on their patriotism, to get them to join this national project of building Pitom and Ramses, and then just slowly but surely having them be the only ones working on this project, and kind of slowly work them into the thorn bush that they can't get out of. The same, and that so.
Rabbi, after a generation of the Jews being slaves in Egypt, they didn't develop some hostility?
No, what I'm saying is, why enslave them in the first place? They were a population living free and and patriotically. And Pharaoh said, and it says Pharaoh and the Egyptians saw this population growing among them, and they came to hate them for no other reason other than the fact that they existed, and they decided to see the Jewish people as a threat, and therefore engage in machinations to turn them into slaves. But they weren't even; it wasn't even the free labor. It was simply we need to control this population because we view it as a threat. Because if some other nation will attack us, the Jewish people will side with them or rebel against us. Why? What? Again, if anything, all indicators that they're a patriotic nation. You're going to exploit their patriotism to make them your slaves. So why do you see them as a threat? And
I thought it was because there were too many of them in their eyes.
Too many patriots is never any nation's problem.
Right.
Unless you view them not as patriots, but as others and as a threat. And that's exactly what happened here. They became disgusted, and then they decided to become threatened by them. And
Okay.
that's the issue. Now, why do I say similar here to Balak? Because what side of the Jordan River is the land of Moab?
The land.
I will tell you, I will give you a big hint. Not on the Israel side. In other words, what threat did the Jewish people pose to Moab? None.
Didn't.
But they chose to feel threatened by the Jewish people, and they chose, therefore, the Jewish people have been making it clear to Edom, to Sichon, to Og, that they just want to pass through. Right, as we said, they really just wanted. You never knew that the road to Israel passes through Brooklyn. You never knew that, but it's clearly they're documented black and white in the Torah. It says we just want to go. It says we want to go B'derech HaMelech. We just want to go on King's Highway, right? King's Highway exit, to Jerusalem. We have no designs on your land, none. Just let us pass through. Not the land of Sichon, not the land of Og, not the land of Balak. Just let us pass through on our way. And yet, again, all of them decided to confront Jewish people, and Balak just decided to do it a little bit different. His way of doing it was engaging in spiritual warfare. He said, clearly, conventional warfare, we're not going to win. We just watched the Jews take down Egypt, Sichon, Og. That's not going to work. But it happens to be that the Moabites had a very good, and they had front row seats to history when an entire nation basically got wiped out because of one man. Mm-hmm. They watched how the Ammonites got wiped out by the Amorites because the Amorites hired an individual named Bilam to curse the Ammonites, and boom, the Ammonites basically were gone completely by that point because of this curse of Bilam. And so Balak is like, all right, if conventional warfare is not going to work, let's reach out to this Bilam guy. Let's ask him to wage a spiritual war against the Jewish people. Now, Bilam is a very interesting character.
To say the
Bilam is,
least.
yes. Bilam, and the fact that the Torah spends so much time talking to us about Bilam is clearly because the Torah wants us to learn from this fellow. Now, Bilam is a very interesting person in the fact that I am going to surprise you by the person I'm going to say that I'm going to draw a contrast between. Now, contrasts are interesting. Contrast means, in order for a contrast to be compelling, they have to be very similar to the thing you're contrasting them to, right? I'm not going to say, let me draw a contrast between a profound idea and a piece of cheesecake.
Have to
Because,
be somehow in the same category, like apples and oranges.
correct, right, exactly right. So I'm saying the contrast I'm going to draw about the person that Bilam is very similar to, and then on the other hand, not similar at all, is who would you
Moshe.
say Bilam is very similar to?
Moshe.
So Paula, by the way, if anybody's figured out, Paula, me
Knows
and Paula
everything.
sit before the class, and clearly we yes, the answer is Moshe. Now, why in
Tell us
the
about
world?
how much she knows.
Yes, it does. It does. Why in the world is Moshe the person to compare Bilam to? The answer is because Zeh leumat zeh asa Elokim. A balance and a counterbalance is how God created the world. The Talmud tells us that at the time of Mashiach, when kind of the epic reckoning of all, right? The nations of the world are going to say, hey, God, it's not fair that the Jewish people are going to get all this recognition, reward, and yada, 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 whatever it is that will happen in the time of Mashiach. It's not fair. You allocated to them resources that you didn't give us. So, of course, they ended up doing a better job than the rest of us. And God says, how so? What do you mean? And they'll say, what do you mean? You gave him a Moshe Rabbeinu. You gave him a Moshe Rabbeinu. You gave them this fellow with the ease of access that Moshe had to God is incomparable. Incomparable. So if they had a Moshe Rabbeinu, really, is it any wonder that they ended up, being, maintaining a gold standard, as it were, to which God will be able to turn and say, I gave you somebody on the caliber of Moshe. And who is that?
Bilam.
Bilam. Believe it or not, in terms of, let's call it quote unquote, ease of access.
Exactly.
To God, Bilam matched Moshe's ease of access. Now it's important, and I've chosen my words carefully as to how to describe in what way Bilam was comparable to Moshe. In prophet and prophecy, Moshe and Bilam were on the same caliber. That in no way speaks to their character, to their nature. And in fact, that is why Bilam is the one to draw the greatest contrast to Moshe. Because in one way, they were very similar. Again, in the access to God, in the level of prophecy, etc. But because of that, it draws the contrast about even more starkly as to how different these two individuals were.
And how they had to go about this interaction with Hashem.
Well,
okay, go ahead. I'll shut up.
No, but I was just saying what, and then we'll come back and revisit, Paula, what you're saying.
Mhm.
So these two people stood above not only their entire generation, but really all the rest of history. And perhaps what is, right, in Washington, D.C., you are measured not by how much money you have or by your, your other, how much you know. You are measured in Washington, by who you know, right?
I was gonna say,
Who do you
that's
know?
the access.
And how long you've been there?
Right. Who's in your Rolodex? Who do you have on speed dial?
Yeah,
Who can you gain access to,
right.
right?
Yes.
You can imagine that if the answer to that question is God himself, I got God on speed dial. That makes you pretty darn important, right?
Lahavdil, I understand very few people have access to Biden. Lahavdil, Lahavdil, Lahavdil.
Right. But the point is, so in which direction do you take that measure of importance? Moshe, the Torah tells us, was the humblest person ever.
Hmm.
Each Moshe anav me'od mikol adam asher al pnei ha'adamah. Moshe was the humblest person ever to live.
Hmm.
And Bilam was the most arrogant person to ever live. For the very same reason. Because they had that kind of accessibility to God. And that is a remarkable testament. Because one's greatness is not measured by the God-given talents or the God-given circumstances and situations. You don't get measured by what God has given you or where God has placed you or the opportunities that God has provided to you, because you didn't do any of that. God did. God gets the quote unquote credit.
Yeah.
What defines your greatness is what do you do and who do you become with these opportunities, with these talents, with these gifts, with these characters, with et cetera, et cetera. And on that, in a very real way, you become defined. So you have Moshe and you have Bilam. When you look at the language of Bilam, this is a person that even when he speaks to God, it's all about him.
Hmm.
It's all about him. It's about what he wants, what he needs from God, et cetera, to the point where God says, listen, I'm talking to you and telling you what to do. You decide you know better. Go ahead. Do it your way. Even as you are talking to God himself, you still manage to make it all about you. And Moshe is the opposite. Even when it's about him, it's not about him. I will mention to kind of talk about the true humbleness, true self-effacement. It's apropos to talk about today, because today is Yud Beis Tammuz, the 12th of Tammuz. Today is a very significant day on the Chabad calendar, really in a very real way, a very significant day on the Jewish calendar. Today is the day that the previous Rebbe who was the previous generation's greatest warrior, period. And I say that, and I challenge anybody. What I mean by let me get a little bit more specific. Greatest Jewish warrior, period. I say this, and I challenge anybody as a matter of historical fact to show me how, on a personal level, on a global level, etc., there was a greater warrior for the Jewish people than the previous Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe, in terms of facing off with, let's say your measure is about the enemy that he had to face. The Frierdiker Rebbe stared communist Russia in the eye, took on communist Russia, took on Nazi Germany, and took on the United States and beat all three of them. We'll mention why in a moment. In terms of his own, in terms of sacrifice and commitment to his ideal, the Frierdiker Rebbe sacrificed his own children, physical and proverbial, to a commitment in the worst, one of the darkest times the Jewish people in common. You have to understand, because this was happening simultaneously as the Holocaust, it oftentimes gets pushed a little bit into the back burner. But what was the highest concentration of Jews was actually not Western Europe, it was Eastern Europe. It was Russia, Poland, etc., etc. Communist Russia was such a dark period in history. Stalin killed 30 million of his own citizens. And what was made the period even darker is that the shock troopers of communist Russia against the Jewish community were Jews. Jews who had been indoctrinated in the communist way because the communists forced you to send your children to their skolas, to their schools. If you didn't, you and the whole family were sent off to Siberia. If the child did not show up, the KGB knew exactly how many people lived in every household. And if your kid did not show up for school, that was it. You were counter-revolutionary, whatever they call it, whatever the thing. So you had to send your kids to the schools. In the schools, your kids were indoctrinated against you and the family and the beliefs, to the point where it was very common that you'd be sitting for supper, and if a parent dared say something against the regime, the child would get up in a huff from the table. 10 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. The kid would be coming back with KGB officers to proudly have his parents arrested and never be seen again. And that is how, in the brutality of what was going on in turning their own citizenry into the shock troopers, caused that in the span of a few years, a country the size of 11 time zones, spanning 11 time zones, would wake up and go to sleep at night, from the moment they woke up to the moment they went to sleep, trembling in fear every waking minute of their life, of their own country, their own children, this is the nightmare existence of communist Russia that went on for half a century.
But also in Germany, because I know my husband was a Holocaust survivor and he was not allowed to go to a bathroom. The parents, he was so frightened of everything or anyone that they would be turned in. I mean, I know that feeling because he would talk about that,
Yes, I'm saying the nightmare was all over. Of course, I'm saying I'm not Nazi Germany. We don't even have to talk about it. Incredibly well documented. What was going on, but simultaneously what was happening in communist Russia, even though at a certain point the Russians were our allies, for Jews that meant nothing. You know, as an American, there's a certain, like, not a soft spot, but it's like, okay, you know, yeah, whatever, we can forgive the Russians because at the end of the day, they help us defeat the Nazis. If you're a Jew, you can never forgive the Russians for what they did.
Right.
On top, my father-in-law, till this day, is so traumatized. He does not give his name over the phone because they're listening.
Mhm.
Because they're listening. It became so ingrained and indoctrinated. It's hard to fathom. Everybody else gave up. Overnight, the highest concentrations of Jews in the world became a desert. Everybody gave up.
Mhm.
Chabad continued fighting. And I can tell you that unequivocally, not as a partisan, but the opposite. I'm only Chabad today because of the truth of that. My great-grandfather was not Chabad. He was actually a Racham Strifka Chassid. But when his father was looking for yeshiva, his father says, I'm willing to commit to putting my son in, no matter what the dangers or whatever it is. There's only one yeshiva left. And he knew that sending his son to the Chabad yeshiva meant that was it. That was the end of their proud heritage and legacy as Racham Stifka Hasidim, and that he would become a Chabad, and that the family would become, at that point forward, become Chabad. And he says, better have him in a yeshiva and let that be the case, because there was only one still fighting the fight. At that point, the Frierdiker Rebbe single-handedly, and I mean single-handedly. Why do I mean single-handedly? Because for a while, when they were building the case against Frierdiker Rebbe, and as I said again, the greatest enemy to the Jewish people in Russia were the Jews themselves, the Russian communists, the Jewish communists, the branch of the government that arrested, that made the case and then arrested the Frierdiker Rebbe was called the Yevsetskia. Yevsetskia is an amalgam of two words, Yevrei Sektskia, which means the Jewish section of the Communist Party. And they are the ones most guilty for the vast majority of Jews sent off to Siberia or wherever it is, or killed in the gulags, etc. And public enemy number, they would print their enemies list every year. And sitting at the top of the list always was Joseph Isaac Schneers. My great-grandfather was sent off to Siberia, never came home, and the crime on his jacket, on his folder, was Agent Schneers. That was enough to have him sent off to Siberia and never come home. And the Frierdiker Rebbe sacrificed hundreds of his own Hasidim, his own children, knowing that they would be going to their death, to not give up this fight. He literally went to war. And the fact that Judaism is not only thriving, it's interesting, because Putin, say what you want about him, he's actually been half decent for the Jewish community. Don't talk about that he's not being a nice guy. Of course, he's not a nice guy. Why he is, it's a puzzle. But the bottom line is he's been good about really putting a significant amount of support in helping the Jewish infrastructure in Russia so flourish. At least in the earlier years they asked him, but it's interesting that he put a lot of support behind Chabad, and many other organizations turned and said, why, you know, there's other organizations here. Why Chabad? You know what Putin's answer was?
What?
I used to be the head of the KGB. I will remember who was my biggest pain in the tuchus when our goal was to close down Judaism. There was only one organization that was putting up any type of fight. Now, when I'm on the other side of the equation and I'm looking to there's only one organization that I would entrust.
Interesting.
But either way, the point is that's part of, I think you'd call his ruthless pragmatism or his ruthlessness as it plays out, and what you might call pragmatism. Again, I am not endorsing Putin at all. In fact, he's one of the worst human beings on the planet. etc., etc. But it's just an interesting insight. But the Frierdiker Rebbe eventually paid the ultimate price, as it were, which is that at a Farbrengen, it all came to this dramatic head on a Farbrengen in 1927. It was Perm Kata in 1927. In the depths of this nightmare, when it was reached a fever pitch, where Hasidim were being caught and deported on a daily basis for being that, and the war. Frierdiker is holding this Farbrengen in Leningrad, and he tears open his shirt and he starts pounding against his chest, and obviously a clandestine Farbrengen. And he says, "We've lost. This has costed us hundreds and hundreds of Hasidim, and I'm asking for more. I'm asking for more of you to do whatever it takes, even if it means Mesirus Nefesh Mamish, even if it means paying the ultimate price. But we can't stop." And he says, and I know that there are informers in this crowd that are going to take my whatever I'm saying. I can even imagine informers we think are horrible, terrible, evil people. Well, what happens when they kidnap your child from you and they say the only way you will see this child again is if you inform?
Right.
We can't imagine what it was like to live there in those days. And the Frierdiker says, I know there's informers among this crowd. And I know this is going to cost me. But it has to be said, this fight, we have to fight to the last man.
Mm-hmm.
And within a week or so of that, they finally arrest, finally, in a sense, Bill, because they know this is arresting the Frierdiker Rebbe would cause an international furor. Decided that they have enough to whatever it is, because they also have now, by this point, figured out that the nexus of this entire web is to this one man, and the files and paperwork, because there's hundreds of cells of underground yeshivas and mikvahs and schools and cheders and all these things, and it all ties back to Frierdiker Rebbe. And to just keep track of, because it's again spanning 11 time zones, all the Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, everything is being kept. Tabs are being kept. All the movements of all these constantly moving cells, getting funds to them, getting resources to them. And so if it's there, the Frierdiker Rebbe, they'll get the paper trail. They'll arrest the Frierdiker Rebbe, and they'll get the paper trail, and they'll bring it all down in one fell swoop. And so one night they bust into the home of the apartment of the previous Rebbe. At that point, in the apartment was the Frierdiker Rebbe, his wife, and their newly engaged daughter. The daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, newly engaged to a distant cousin of hers, who is the son of the chief rabbi of the biggest Jewish city in Ukraine, a city called Yekaterinoslav, now known as Dnepropetrovsk or Dnipro. The son, her daughter, engaged to the son of the Yekaterinoslav Rav, whose name is Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, and this young man's name is Menachem Mendel Schneerson, will eventually become the seventh Rebbe. Now happens to be, with divine providence, that the Rebbe was not there at 2 a.m. He was involved and engaged in again in all the clandestine efforts, and he was out, but he was soon to return, and he was about to walk right into the trap, into the dragnet. To give you a sense of the bravery that the whole family displayed, the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's wife, the daughter, basically, of the previous Rebbe, as the house is being ransacked by the KGB, knowing that this means she'll probably never see her father again. And this is happening in real time. She's sitting on the windowsill, looking out to the street surreptitiously. And when she sees her fiance turn the corner and start heading to the apartment, not knowing what's going on in there, she yells out to him while the KGB officers are in the room, and she says, "Schneerson, we have guests." And the Rebbe hears this and turns the corner and disappears back into the night, and therefore stays free to be able to coordinate the whole international effort of the pressure campaign, et cetera, and keep the Frierdiker Rebbe's efforts going while he's in prison. But they arrest the Frierdiker Rebbe, but to their terrible disappointment, there's not a shred of paperwork. No physical record whatsoever as to where the monies are coming from and where they are going and the names of the contacts and all the different cells, whatever it is. Everything is in the Friedrich head. Everything. This entire network is being run out of the supercomputer that's in the Friedrich head. Which is why the Friedrich was subject to terrible and brutal interrogations for the time that he was there, to the point where later in his life, he couldn't physically walk. They damaged him physically to the point where at the end of life he was relegated to a wheelchair. But again, it was the Friedrich Rebbe originally was going to pay the ultimate price. He had a sentence of execution against him. The Friedrich Rebbe kept a diary, a daily diary. And he writes about this period in his life, and he calls it Tractate Hell, Masechet Gehenim, chapters 1, 2, and 3. And to read it is to be inspired beyond belief, because he wrote always a beautiful pen. Very, very descriptively, very candidly. And he writes about the whole thing, and you literally, and they call it, the English translation, they made a book out of it, they call it Prince in Prison. And you are seeing royalty in the darkest of nightmarish places. They took him to a prison where the value of life was so cheap that they would execute regularly 300 or so inmates a night. And in this place, the Friedrich Rebbe describes what it was like to be there. And one of the most painful aspects of this for the Friedrich Rebbe writes, is, besides for all the brutal interrogations, the Friedrich Rebbe writes about being thrown downstairs and being pulled out at all hours. His tefillin were confiscated, and he went on to a hunger strike. It was remarkable to see a man who did not bend or bow. There was two primary officers on his case. One was named Lulav, and the other's name was Nachmanson. And this Nachmanson comes to him at one point, and he tells him, Nachmanson says, this is the KGB officers who built the entire case against him, were the ones that arrested him, and the ones that were leading the brutal interrogations and etc. And this Nachmanson gleefully tells him a story. He says, your father was the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, and he had two Hasidim. He had a Hasidic couple, a husband and a wife, that for years couldn't have children. And it was your father's blessing that resulted in them having a child. And he says, do you know how I know this story? Because that child is this Nachmanson that stands in front of you, and I will bring you down. And that was the depth of the indoctrination. And the Friedrich Rebbe but what remarkable, Friedrich Rebbe never lost his royalty, any Jew who was part of the process, interrogation, whatever it is, he would only speak to them in Yiddish. It's like, you don't get to set the terms of this engagement. I will set the terms. You are Jewish and I am Jewish, and I will speak to you in Yiddish, and you will have to deal with it. And if he was davening, it didn't make a difference what they wanted from him, the schlepping him out. They would beat him in his cell because he wouldn't recognize, he wouldn't acknowledge the guards or whatever if he was in the middle of davening. But at davening, if he was davening, to the point once where they were beating him because he wouldn't stand up and interrupt his davening to hear what they said. Came in, they beat him, they left, they came back, he was still in the middle of davening, they beat him. Finally, one of them was Jewish and couldn't bear to see it anymore. Even his own humanity peeked through for a second. He says, Rebbe, they want to tell you that they're lightening your sentence and they're letting you out of the prison and taking you instead to exile. And the Friedrich Rebbe still said, 1 minute, when I'm done davening, right now I'm in an audience with God. It was remarkable to read through these stories. It's the sentence originally goes from execution to 10 years hard labor in Siberia, which is basically an execution for somebody of his age. From there to 3 years exile in Kostroma, a fate, by the way, that the Rebbe's father actually suffered and never came home from it. Was not there at his own son's wedding, and he stayed in Russia. Eventually, the Rebbe's mother made it over to the United States, but the Rebbe's father passed away in exile. And the previous, his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, also had a sentence of 3 years in Kostroma. Miraculously, 10 days later, the tables had turned so significantly that 10 days later, on the Friedrich Rebbe's birthday, today, the 12th of Tammuz, he was ordered to be released. Now, it was a clerical holiday, and they couldn't get through the paperwork on the day. So they had the previous Rebbe sign an affidavit that it's not their fault, that they wanted to truly release him on the 12th, and they had to please sign this affidavit that you do not hold us responsible for releasing you 1 day later because it was a clerical holiday and we couldn't get the. That's how much the. But eventually, they said you're too much of a political hot potato, and they booted him out of Russia, and he arrived in Warsaw just in time for the Blitzkrieg. Which is, and he was there conducting Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur services. Yom Kippur services. We have it in Warsaw, in the ghetto. Well, not the ghetto, in Warsaw, and the building he was doing a Kol Nidre service, and the building that he was doing gets bombed and collapses on top of it.
Oh my God.
They dig themselves out of the rubble, move to the next building, and continue the service.
Unbelievable.
This is the Friedrich Rebbe. Eventually, this is a fascinating, another book you can go find called Out of the Inferno. It's not a book written with any narration. It's just a collection of all the telegraphs and all the documentation back and forth, how the American State Department was in touch regularly with their counterparts in German military intelligence, with Admiral Canaris himself. For those who know, that he was the head of the Abwehr, a well-known figure, a historic figure. He was the head of German military intelligence. Eventually, Hitler had him executed because he was part of the old guard and not loyal enough to the SS, as we're about to see in this story. Canaris worked to smuggle the Friedrich Rebbe and his family in the back of a German military transport with some soldiers loyal to him rather than the SS. Straight through Berlin, German soldiers, Friedrich Rebbe, straight through Berlin to get the Friedrich Rebbe out of Europe. And the stories along the way are absolutely just mind-boggling. At one point, this covered jeep was stopped by an SS checkpoint, and the one who was leading this clandestine effort was a major in the German army, Major Bloch. And he says, "Let me pass." He pulled rank. I'm a major. I'm higher up on the ranks, but the SS didn't have any respect for anybody or anything because they were a political entity, or directly answerable only to the Führer and nobody else. And it was basically a standoff where they said, "We want to see what's in the back of that Jeep, and I don't care that you're a major, I want to see what's in the back of the Jeep." And in the back of the Jeep is the Schneerson family. And this major says, you're going to see that you're going to have to go through me if you want to get into the back of that Jeep. And it was a standoff. It was nearly a standoff to the death. In the end, finally, the SS officer is the one who blinked first, as the expression goes, and he stood down. But there was these kind of stories with the American State Department in contact with to get the Friedrich Rebbe through literally Germany, Nazi Germany, through Nazi Berlin, eventually on a ship that arrived in America. The final 10 years of his life, the Friedrich Rebbe, as we said, at that point, can't walk. And he arrives at the pier in New York, and he stares over a vast sea of his Hasidim, who are jubilantly there at the pier to welcome their Rebbe to the United States. And this is the scene he sees. The last 10 years of his life, after he'd done everything he did in Russia and Germany, etc., Poland, Germany. He's looking at this across the sea of his so Hasidim, and there's not a beard among the crowd. This is a different type of Hasidim. America is a very different place, and that's what they were all telling him. They said, listen, this is not Europe. America is anders. America is different, they told him. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, with a sense of tremendous gratitude for what America is and what America is doing, stared America in the eye and said, America is nit anders. America is no different. And by the time I'm done with America, America's going to look a lot more like me than I'm going to look like it. They told him there's no, as a Jew, you have to work on Shabbos. You take off your beard, you work on Shabbos. If you don't work on Shabbos, you don't have a job on Monday.
The Chassids told him this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many of them themselves had no choice to say, look, we're Hasidim, we are Hasidim, we consider ourselves Hasidim, we're descended from Hasidim, but we came to America, and this is the way you got to play ball here in America, right? And by ball, I mean baseball, and apple pie, and all these things, and it's wonderful, and it's great, but nobody has a beard here. You work on Shabbos, you try to find a way that the work that you do on Shabbos should not be a direct violation of Shabbos, or whatever it is. But you will literally, there was no employment rights or laws. You didn't work on Shabbos. Sunday is the day of rest. Shabbos is a regular work day. You didn't work on Shabbos. You didn't have a job on Monday.
On
Finish
Monday.
story.
Right.
And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, by the time I'm going to be done with you, there's going to be Chol Yisrael in Kentucky. And there's going to be more yeshivas in America than there ever was in Europe. And nobody believed him, not even his own Chassid. And the Frierdiker rolled up his sleeves, and to the last day of his life ensured that the way that he took down Russia, as it were, the way that he took forced Germany to even Nazi Germany to bend to his will, that America, that he was going to quote unquote conquer America for God. This is the Frierdiker Rebbe. And today is the day. Again, I challenge you to think of a tougher warrior for the Jewish people in that lifetime, in that generation, than the Frierdiker Rebbe. But I do want to say something, because we started this whole conversation by saying that that he was sitting in prison, and he writes there in the prison about the tremendous pain and suffering it was to be in this prison. And the Rebbe, our Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, looks at that and says that is in fact quite puzzling. The sentiment from the Frierdiker Rebbe is quite puzzling. Why? He says, because and I'll tell my own little anecdote. We once took our kids down to Florida. Paula, that was the trip that we came to visit you. And for Shabbos, we were staying in the complexes. Anybody said Orlando? It's a very interesting place. Massive tracts of land that get bought up by management, right? And they build 100 houses. They're all cookie cutter. And they put some sort of entertainment kind of thing in the center of it, like the jelly at the center of the donut. Right?
Clubhouse.
And then they buy for, and each one of these complexes, the scale of it is just, there's 100 or so houses being built all at the same time. And half a year later, boom, it's a mini city just right there. And then you look around and there's another 5 of them going up simultaneously. So it turns out that we took this, it was a great launch point. We had a great time with the kids. We had this little place that we were in, had this beautiful little kind of water park complex in the center of it. And our place had a pool, it was great. And from there, we did day trips to Kennedy Space Center and to Gatorland and all this kind of stuff. It was great. It was really, really great trip. The issue was we were going to be there for Shabbos. And we needed a minyan, a place to daven, etc. So we looked, and 2 complexes over was a place called Champions Gate. Champions Gate, the yeshiva in Orlando had made an arrangement because there's something called Yeshiva Week which ironically is when the yeshiva closes and all the yeshiva students go out.
Go
But
to Orlando.
yeah, and oftentimes go straight down south to Orlando, and the yeshiva makes an arrangement with somebody who's renting a big enough house, offers to host in this house, either in the big garage or whatever it is, a minyan for anybody, other families who are in the area, they lend the Torah and so on and so forth. So we found Champions Gate, it's 3 miles away. So I said to my kids, okay, who's up for a jaunt? Well, it'll take about an hour, maybe an hour and 50 minutes. The outing's 9:30. We'll start at 8:15. I memorized the directions from Google Maps, and we headed out that morning, only to realize that Google Maps didn't take into consideration that an entire new complex was being excavated in the big no man's land that was separating this one from that one. And what began as an hour little jaunt became a 3.5 hour obstacle course in the tremendous heat, over barbed wire fences, under this. It was crazy. Me and my 4 kids, we like popped out of this like no man's land. Like workers are working on this one house in the middle. There's nothing else for like 100 yards in hundreds of yards in any direction. And all of a sudden comes this rabbi in the tallis or whatever it is, just like rustling out of the bushes. And they're like, these workers are like, what in the world? He's like, the aliens could have landed and been less surprising than this, just like popping out of the bushes out in the middle of nowhere. We make it finally to Champions Gate, to this place, right in time for V'nei Emar V'haya. They finished. They literally were finishing the minyan. We come out, we're beat red, and we got the prospect of 3.5 hours back. And I'm with, this is a couple of years ago, I'm with my down to my Maisha that was then like 7 or maybe even 6, 7, I think. And so this big house was being rented by kind of this matriarch and patriarch, the grandparents who had all their married kids and their families together. They did this big thing. So to do this Orlando trip, they're the ones that have the house. So one of the sons who was part of the minyan, he's knocking on the door, married son, whatever it is, and he says, invites us in so we can get a drink and some snacks before we're going to literally turn around and walk the 3 hours back. And the grandmother's like going on and on. It's like, oh my gosh, so brave and so whatever it is, how it's special. Da, da, da. And this guy from Lakewood, New Jersey, not a Chabad Chassid, he says, Ma, these are Lubavitchers. They love their Mesiras Nefesh. They love their self-sacrifice. Come on, it's like this is going to be the highlight of their trip.
They'll tell the story for years.
Suffer for God, and says like this is right. So the Rebbe kind of asks about the previous Rebbe sitting in prison and going through the trials and tribulations. He's puzzled by the Frierdiker Rebbe's negative tone, as it were.
Oh my
right?
God.
Shouldn't the Frierdiker Rebbe, to a certain degree, not necessarily not joy, but welcome this opportunity and value this opportunity to show his devotion to God? The Rebbe is obviously asking from a philosophical standpoint, not saying but he's driving home a point. Saying because we do. This is exactly what Rabbi Akiva said. All right, hi Noah. Welcome back to the class.
I know.
So cute.
So, because what did Rabbi Akiva say when he was being told that the Romans are about to put him to death because of his devotion for Judaism? Rabbi Akiva said, "Atazai," because Rabbi Akiva, of course, speaks Yiddish, and he says, "Finally," he says, "Kol yomai, all my days I waited, masai yavai liyadi v'akamenu." When will this moment finally come to my hand, and I will be able to show this last, fullest measure of my devotion to God?
Yeah, the Shema.
Yeah, I want it. So, says the Rebbe, how come we're seeing a different message from the previous Rebbe, where he's speaking about his incarceration with a kind of a negative sense? Shouldn't he be saying, thank you, God, for this opportunity for me to show my own devotion to you? And the Rebbe says something fascinating here. And this goes all the way back to what we were saying in the very beginning about Moshe and his humbleness. In the very first address that the Rebbe ever gave to taking over, in a sense, the leadership from his father-in-law, upon his father-in-law's passing, he gave a Hasidic discourse on the words "Basi Lagani" from Shir Hashim. I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. Right, about whatever how it connects, but at a certain point, he's comparing two well-known paragons of self-sacrifice, Rabbi Akiva and our patriarch Avram Avinu. Right? Rabbi Akiva was put to death by the Romans. Avram Avinu was basically going to be put to death by Nimrod. He tried his hardest, right? He threw him into a fiery furnace, right? And yet, says the says the Rebbe there, we see two different reactions from Rabbi Akiva and from Avram Avinu. When Rabbi Akiva heard the news, we said he welcomed it. He cherished his opportunity. And when Avram Avinu heard that he was going to be incarcerated and he was going to be thrown into prison, and then put to death, it says, he was pained by this news. So conventional wisdom would say that in this case, Rabbi Akiva is showing the greater sense of devotion and self-sacrifice, welcoming the news rather than being pained by the news. And the Rebbe says it's actually the other way around. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva wanted this opportunity to show God his ultimate devotion. And Avram Avinu says, every minute that I spend in prison, and yes, I'm able therefore to show my devotion to God, is another minute that I cannot be out there teaching about God. It's not about me. This is not about me. Why was Avram Avinu bothered about being in prison? Not because prison was painful to him, but prison meant he couldn't be out there doing what God needs him to be doing. An opportunity for me to show my devotion, my sacrifice, wonderful. Who cares? Who cares about me showing my devotion, etc., etc.? There's a mission that needs to be out there. The world needs to know about God, and I'm stuck in this fakakta prison.
But doesn't the Rebbe say you're never stuck?
True. But,
wants you to be where just you are.
Correct. And that's obviously that's the point from there, the Friedrich Rebbe. But the idea the Rebbe is driving home is that, of course, the Friedrich Rebbe could have been focused on the idea that this is an opportunity for him to show his devotion, etc., etc. But the Friedrich Rebbe says, if I'm in here, then I can't be out there. What's important? Why this is so important is that's the level of humbleness and self-effacement of Moshe Rabbeinu. You know who it was least important? The demonstrations of Moshe Rabbeinu's devotion to God. Do you know who that bothered the least? Moshe Rabbeinu. Because Moshe was not focused on, am I showing God how devoted and am I scoring points by God? To Moshe Rabbeinu, the most important thing was, what is God's will and is it being done? How many points I score, how many points I'm not scoring, how much the devotion and again, I'm not trying to overly simplify Rabbi Akiva. I'm not saying that he's trying to quote unquote score points. But Moshe Rabbeinu, it was not about him. It never was. That Bilam, even when it was about God, it was still about him.
Oh, yeah.
And for Moshe Rabbeinu, even when it was about him, it was still about God. And there's incredible strength in it. Because then you never sit there and measure yourself up to the moment. Am I, can I achieve, can I not achieve? What's the mission? Let me go. They say, and I'll finish on this point, that Napoleon, when he lost the war to Russia, he says that he turned at one point deciding the treaty or whatever it is, it's a building. This is the anecdote, it never happened, but it comes to like a good thought exercise, as it were. And he turns to the Tsar and he says, how did I lose to you? How did I lose to you? I'm a better strategist, I'm a better general, my soldiers are better trained, they're better equipped, yada, yada, yada. All the things point to my favor. Why did I lose? And the Tsar says, because I have more devoted soldiers. What do you mean you have more devoted soldiers? Nobody has more devoted soldiers than me. Napoleon says, okay, let's put it to the test. So they go to the roof of this tower, and Napoleon says, want to see how devoted my soldiers are to me? Jean-Pierre, viens ici, right? Jean-Pierre, get over here. Oui, mon général. Right? Yes, my general. He says, I want you to jump off this building. To your death, jump. Oui, mon général. Yes, my general. Please answer me one question. Tell me why, so that as I fall to my death, I can know how I am serving. He says, because you are showing the devotion of the French army. Ah, good enough for him. He takes a leaping jump, and he probably jumps like some French, or like the flair of the French,
Ballet.
Right? Yeah, ballet pirouettes off the top of
Azai.
right? And then, so Napoleon turns and says, to which the Tsar turns to him and says,
Change the accents. I
man,
love
I
it.
can't. I'll tell you. If there was any, I am definitely not politically correct over here, right? But either way. But then, Ivan, idi suda. Right, get over here. Right. Right. Da nachalnik. All right. Yeah. Yes, my general. Ivan, jump off the building. That. Yeah. Da nachalnik. Absolutely, my general. I have just one question. Which side? Right. It's a little bit of a nuanced point, but Moshe Rabbeinu was never concerned by how sophisticated his relationship with God got. He woke up in the morning with one question on his mind. How do I fulfill God's mission here in this world? How do I fulfill his will? We're not necessarily all going to be there, but we should aspire. We should aspire for a level where we are what they say in Yiddish, durchsichtig. We are transparent. We are transparent. Somewhere, definitely closer on the spectrum to that side than to the Bilam side. God imbues us with such tremendous blessings, such tremendous talent, etc., etc. The result of it, the question that we ask ourselves is, how does God want me to use these traits? How do I wake up in the morning and bring Mashiach? with what it is that Hashem has uniquely given me. All right, everybody?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Very different class. Shouldn't we say,
Thank you.
shouldn't we say just for fun, Matovu Alecha Yaakov?
Exactly.
Shouldn't we just,
We should do more than that. Everybody, those who can sing it beautifully, and those who can draw it beautifully, and those who can teach it beautifully, everyone should find their unique talent and the God-given thing, and present it and share it with other people. That's the point. And that was the Rebbe's point. Every single one of us is a person on a mission. If you know Aleph, go out and teach Aleph. And if you know Bet, take whatever talent or opportunities Hashem provides you and be a person on a mission. You shouldn't be in the frame, in other words, because you're too busy pointing the camera.
Okay. Back
thank
to
you,
my mission. Can I
Rabbi.
see you on Tuesday morning?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay,
Shabbat
good.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. For all of you
Shabbat shalom l'chulam.
the Bethesda area on Thursday, please join us, where we're going to hear from a man who actually lived this ideal, lives it, I guess, but lived it definitely on October 7th. One who won the Israel Prize and went in again and again and again to save as many lives from kibbutz Be'er
Wow.
as possible. So come to that. All right. Bye, Noah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And the rest of you. But bye, Noah. And Diane, if ever you need just to talk, okay?
Thank you
Oh.
so much. Thank you. I wanted to know, did he go to the right or the left? And you didn't tell us when he asked.
That's like the lady and the tiger. I don't know if you remember that story about the lady and the
Sure.
tiger.
Sure.
And that never had an ending. And it's
Right.
incredibly frustrating to this day.
Right.
Yes. All right.
I just had to say
Bye-bye.
that. See you Saturday.
Bye. See you.